In the months that followed, the woman continued her studies, but now she also began to think about what came next. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was open to the possibilities. Her music had brought her this far, and she realized that it could take her further if she allowed it to. She wasn't sure if she would perform again in front of large audiences, but she knew that the music would always be a part of her, guiding her, comforting her, and allowing her to communicate in ways words never could. One evening, as she sat at the piano, the soft light from the lamp casting a warm glow over the keys, her mind wandered to the future. She thought about what she could do with her music. For years it had been her personal sanctuary, a space where she could be alone with her thoughts and feelings, but now it seemed as though there was more she could do with it, something that could reach beyond the walls of her practice room and connect with others in a meaningful way. Her teacher had mentioned the possibility of performing professionally, of sharing her music with a wider audience. The idea had seemed daunting at first. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of commitment, for the pressure that came with performing for large crowds. But the more she thought about it, the more the idea started to resonate with her. She didn't have to change who she was, didn't have to seek fame or recognition. She could perform for the sake of the music, for the sake of sharing what she loved with others. The thought of it no longer seemed as intimidating as it once had. One afternoon, the woman found herself walking through the city, her mind still occupied with the idea of performing. She had always kept to herself, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that sharing her music could be a way to connect with others in a way she hadn't before. The city was busy, filled with the sounds of people going about their lives, but for her, the world felt quieter than usual. It was as if the noise around her had faded, and all that remained was the idea of what could be. She didn't know exactly where her journey would take her, but for the first time, she felt ready to take the next step. Later that evening, as she sat in the small coffee shop where she had often come to practice, she found herself thinking about the conversation she had had with her teacher. He had always been patient with her, always respected her quiet nature. But he had also believed in her talent, her potential. He had seen something in her that she had never fully recognized in herself. And now, as she sat there with her coffee and notebook in front of her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to share what she had with the world. The thought wasn't as terrifying as it once was. She had spent years developing her skills, but it had always been a personal journey. The idea of sharing her music wasn't about seeking approval or validation. It was about connecting with others, sharing the emotions and experiences that had shaped her music. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition, but she did want her music to touch others in the same way it had always touched her. It was about finding a way to communicate that felt authentic, that felt real. A few weeks later, the woman found herself standing on the stage of a small, intimate concert hall. The audience was modest, but their expectations were high. It wasn't a grand venue, but it didn't matter. For her, it was a place where she could connect with others in a way that felt comfortable, a space where the music could speak for itself. She wasn't performing for the applause, but for the opportunity to share something personal, something that had been a part of her for so long. As she sat at the piano, her fingers lightly touching the keys, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The room was quiet, the audience waiting in anticipation. She didn't look at them, didn't focus on their gaze. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music fill her thoughts. She had played countless times in practice rooms, but this time, it was different. This time, she was playing for an audience, but more importantly, she was playing for herself. It was a subtle shift in perspective, but it made all the difference. The first notes of the piece filled the room, soft and gentle, like a whisper. Her fingers moved over the keys with a quiet confidence, each note flowing seamlessly into the next. There was no rush, no pressure, only the music. As she played, she could feel the audience connecting with her, not just with the technical aspects of her performance, but with the emotions woven into every note. The music spoke to them in a way words never could, drawing them into a world where everything else faded away. It was a connection that was both personal and universal, a bond created through the shared experience of the music. The performance continued, each piece building on the last, each note a reflection of her own journey, her own struggles and her own growth. As she played, she began to feel something shift within her. She was no longer just a musician performing for an audience. She was a storyteller, sharing her own narrative through the language of music. And in that moment she realized that this was what she had been searching for all along, an authentic connection with others, a way to share her passion and her emotions without saying a word. When the final note of the last piece lingered in the air, the audience sat in stunned silence as if they were afraid to disturb the moment. And then slowly the applause began. It wasn't loud or frantic, but it was sincere, heartfelt. The woman stood up, giving a small, humble bow, but there was no hesitation in her now. She had shared her music, and that was enough. The recognition, the applause, it didn't matter. What mattered was the connection she had made with the audience, the shared experience that had brought them all together through the music. After the performance, the woman stood at the back of the hall, waiting as the audience filed out. She didn't expect anyone to approach her, but a few did, offering their thanks and admiration. She smiled, acknowledging their words with quiet gratitude. But she didn't seek out conversations. She didn't need to. The music had already spoken for her. As she left the concert hall that evening, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt before. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she knew that her music was a part of her journey, one that she was ready to share with the world. It wasn't about fame or recognition or applause, it was about the music and the connections it could create. She didn't know what would come next, but she was ready to take whatever steps felt right for her, knowing that the music would always guide her. It had brought her to this point, and it would carry her forward no matter where the journey took her. The quiet woman had found her place in the world, not in the spotlight but in the music, and in the connections she could make through it. The music continued to fill the room, each note echoing in the grand space, soft yet powerful. Clara, still seated at the piano, could feel the rhythm of her fingers moving with ease. At first her hands had felt uncertain, shaky with nerves, but now as the melody grew, she felt something shift. The tension in her body began to loosen, and she played more confidently as if the piano was guiding her through the performance. The audience, still silent, watched her closely. A few guests exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. There were whispers here and there, but no one dared to speak out loud. Everyone had expected the performance to be a disaster, a joke that would soon be over. But as Clara's music filled the air, something unexpected happened. The laughter that had once buzzed through the crowd seemed to fade away. People stopped pointing and started to listen. The unpolished, awkward maid at the piano was no longer a joke. For Clara, it wasn't about impressing anyone. She didn't need their approval. The music was her escape, her one chance to express herself. The more she played, the more she felt the weight of her responsibilities, her worries, her fears slipping away. It was as though the piano had become a part of her, and the audience was just an afterthought. She was no longer performing for them. She was performing for herself. Her fingers danced lightly across the keys, each note flowing like a river. Clara had always loved music. She'd been playing piano since she was a child, but it was a love she'd kept hidden from the world. Growing up, she had no one to share her passion with, no one to appreciate the beauty in the way she could make the piano come alive. Her family had never had the resources for lessons, but Clara had taught herself, picking up pieces by ear and practicing for hours after school. Music had always been there, a quiet presence in her life. It was a language she could speak fluently, one that didn't need words. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Clara was playing in front of people, strangers no less. And although she was terrified, something inside her told her to keep going. The music had a life of its own. It wasn't just notes on a page. It was emotion. It was her soul. It was everything she had held inside for years. As the piece came to a close, Clara's hands hovered over the keys for a brief moment. She took a slow, steady breath, feeling the warmth of the spotlight on her skin. The room was still. No one made a sound. Clara opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of faces in front of her. She couldn't see them clearly, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. For a brief moment, Clara wondered if she had made a mistake. What if they didn't like it? What if they thought she was terrible? Just some maid who didn't belong here. But then she remembered what had brought her here in the first place. Her love for music, her need to express herself, and her desire to feel something real, something honest. It wasn't about their judgment, it never had been. She stood up from the piano, her legs slightly trembling beneath her, and for a moment she almost expected the room to erupt with laughter. She braced herself, ready for the ridicule. But what happened next shocked her. The room was silent for a few long seconds, as if no one quite knew how to respond. And then slowly it began. Applause. A soft clap at first, unsure, hesitant. But as Clara stood there, unsure of what was happening, the applause grew louder. People stood up, clapping more eagerly, nodding to one another in appreciation. The noise spread through the room like wildfire, and soon, nearly every guest in the ballroom was on their feet, applauding her performance. Clara stood frozen, her heart racing. Was this really happening? Did they like it? A few guests who had once whispered and laughed now looked at Clara with wide eyes, their expressions full of admiration. Some were even smiling, while others seemed almost in awe of what they had just witnessed. For a moment it felt like a dream. Clara wasn't sure if she could believe it. The applause continued for a few more moments until Clara finally took a tentative step back, trying to hide her overwhelming emotions. She didn't know what to do with herself. She had just played in front of an entire ballroom full of people, and not only had they accepted her, but they had celebrated her. But what surprised her most wasn't the applause. It wasn't the recognition. It was the way the music had connected her to the audience. For the first time in years, Clara felt seen. She felt heard. The audience wasn't just applauding her performance, they were applauding her. It was as if they had understood the deep, hidden parts of her that she had never shared with anyone. The event organizers, who had initially been frantic and uncertain, were now beaming. They rushed up to her, congratulating her profusely. One of them even gave her a hug, which was something Clara had never expected. She had gone from being the invisible maid to the star of the evening. They had been wrong about her from the very beginning. Clara wasn't just a maid, she was an artist. But even as the compliments poured in, Clara couldn't help but feel a little overwhelmed. She was still trying to process what had just happened. How had she gone from being the target of mockery to the center of attention? How had her fingers, trembling with nerves just moments ago, managed to create something so beautiful that it moved people? For a brief moment, Clara felt like she might cry, but she quickly wiped away the thought. No, she couldn't cry now. Not in front of everyone. Instead, she took a deep breath, stood a little taller, and smiled. But there was one thing Clara couldn't shake from her mind. She had done something that no one had expected. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she had proved something, not to the guests, but to herself. She had stepped into the light and she had shown the world who she really was. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new, something she had been too afraid to pursue for years. As the applause slowly died down, Clara turned toward the piano again. It was as if the world had paused for a moment. The music, her music, had given her something she hadn't known she needed. A sense of belonging, a sense of recognition, and most importantly, a sense of self. For the first time in her life, Clara felt like she had a place in this world. And in that moment she realized that she had found something more valuable than all the wealth and status in the room. She had found her voice. Clara stood near the grand piano, still trying to process what had just happened. The applause had died down, but the energy in the room was alive, buzzing. Guests continued to congratulate her, some with wide smiles, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They couldn't seem to get over it. How had someone who had been cleaning the floors just moments ago managed to perform so beautifully? But Clara, despite all the attention, felt strangely disconnected from it all. She had done what she set out to do, share her music, but now that it was over, she didn't know what to do with herself. The spotlight felt too bright, the compliments too much. All she wanted was to be alone, to breathe, to step out of the whirlwind that had taken over her life for the past few minutes. A few of the hotel staff members came over to her, still amazed by the performance. "Clara, that was incredible," one of them said, her voice full of awe. "I had no idea you could play like that." Clara offered a small smile but didn't know how to respond. "I never really talked about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something I've always kept to myself." The other staff members nodded. They understood. For years, Clara had been a quiet presence in the hotel. She worked hard, always with a smile, never drawing attention to herself. It had always been that way. But now it seemed like everyone was paying attention to her. Clara wasn't used to this. She didn't know how to handle it. As the night wore on, Clara tried to slip back into the background, just like she always had. But it was impossible. The guests who had once mocked her now wanted to talk to her, to ask her questions. They wanted to know everything about her. How long she had been playing the piano, what inspired her, where she had learned to play so well. It was overwhelming. Every time someone spoke to her, Clara could feel her cheeks flush, her hands twitch nervously. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. At first, she had felt a sense of accomplishment, even pride. She had done something unexpected, something no one had ever thought she could do. She had shared a piece of herself with the world, and for a moment she had been seen. But now, as people crowded around her, asking questions and offering compliments, Clara began to feel small again. The music had been her escape, her way of expressing herself without saying a word. But now, it felt like the very thing that had brought her attention was the thing that was making her feel more distant from everyone. She excused herself from the small group of guests, telling them she needed a break. They were disappointed, but Clara couldn't stay there any longer. She needed to breathe, to step away from the spotlight that had suddenly been thrust upon her. She wandered through the back hallways of the hotel, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The lights were dim here and the air was quiet. It was a stark contrast to the bustling ballroom she had just left. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. What had just happened? It felt surreal, like something she had imagined. Clara had never wanted fame. She had never dreamed of being on stage. Music was her personal refuge, the one place she could be herself without any expectations or pressures. She had never imagined that her love for the piano could lead to something like this, and yet here she was, standing in a hallway trying to make sense of it all. As she walked, Clara's thoughts turned inward. Why had she never shared her love for music before? What had held her back all these years? She had kept it hidden, locked away like a secret, afraid that if she let anyone see it, they would take it away from her. But tonight had shown her something different. The music had not only been a release for her, but it had also touched others in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the notes or the performance, it was about the emotions, the story behind the music. And in that moment, Clara realized something she had never fully understood before. Music was meant to be shared. She didn't have to keep it to herself. She could play for others, let them in, and maybe, just maybe, they would understand her in a way that words could never express. But as Clara reflected on this, a new thought crept into her mind. What if she wasn't good enough to keep doing this? What if the applause tonight was just a fluke? What if the guests had only been impressed because they had low expectations to begin with? What if she wasn't truly capable of being the musician she secretly wanted to be? These doubts clouded her mind as she continued walking through the empty hallways. Clara had always struggled with self-doubt. She had spent so many years being quiet, blending into the background, that the idea of standing out, of being truly seen, terrified her. What if her performance had been an accident? What if she could never live up to what everyone expected of her now? Just then, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was one of the event organizers, the same person who had asked her to play earlier. He had a kind smile on his face, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Clara, are you okay?" he asked. She gave a small, forced smile. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her. The organizer stepped closer, studying her face. "Listen, I know this must be overwhelming for you, but you were incredible tonight. I've never seen anything like it." Clara shook her head. "I don't know if I can do it again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. What if it was just a one-time thing? The organizer smiled gently, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to do anything. Just be yourself. You have a gift, Clara, and tonight you shared it with all of us. That's all anyone could ask for." His words brought a small measure of comfort to Clara, but the doubt still lingered in her mind. She had shared her gift, but what if it wasn't enough? What if she wasn't enough? The organizer seemed to sense her unease. "I don't think anyone will ever forget tonight," he said softly. "You may not believe it now, but you've changed things here. People are going to remember you." Clara wasn't sure what to say to that. She had never thought of herself as someone people would remember. She had always been just Clara, the maid who cleaned the floors, who quietly did her job without drawing attention. Now everything had changed, and she didn't know how to feel about it. The organizer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You'll figure it out," he said with a smile. "You just need to trust yourself." Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she could. But as she stood there in the quiet hallway, surrounded by the soft hum of the hotel, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the organizer's words, or maybe it was just the quiet assurance that she had made it through the night. Whatever it was, Clara knew that things would never be the same. She had shared her music, and for the first time she felt like it was enough. The following days after the event were a blur for Clara. She had returned to her usual routine at the hotel, going through the motions of her work, but everything felt different. The guests still greeted her with smiles and polite words, but there was an undercurrent of something new. People seemed to watch her with curiosity now, their eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than before. Clara wasn't sure how to handle it. She had spent so many years blending into the background, and now it seemed as though everyone could see her. It wasn't just the staff at the hotel. The guests, too, seemed to remember her. Every time Clara passed by a group of people, she could hear snippets of conversation. They were talking about her performance, marveling at her unexpected talent. Some of them even approached her, offering congratulations, asking her to perform again, or telling her how moving the music had been. But Clara didn't know how to respond to them. She had never been good at handling compliments. "Thank you," she would say quietly, feeling a flush of warmth rise to her cheeks. But the words always felt awkward, as if she didn't truly deserve them. The truth was, Clara was still in shock. She had never imagined that her quiet, private love for music could lead to something so public. She had played because it was something she had to do for herself, not for anyone else. But now that it was over, she felt like she had opened a door she couldn't close. People expected more from her, and that was both exhilarating and terrifying. One afternoon, a few days after the performance, the hotel manager stopped by Clara's usual cleaning station near the back of the hotel. She had been wiping down the counters, going through the motions of her work when he appeared in front of her. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need to talk to you about something." Clara looked up, startled. "Of course, sir. Is everything okay?" The manager smiled at her. "Yes, everything's fine. But we've been getting a lot of positive feedback about your performance. People want to know when you'll play again." Clara's stomach dropped. I don't know about that. I wasn't planning on performing again." The manager seemed to understand her hesitation. "I get it. But listen, people are talking. They loved what you did. They want more. And we're thinking about holding another event, a special concert. We'd like you to be part of it." Clara felt a wave of panic wash over her. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. She had never wanted to be the center of attention. The idea of playing again in front of so many people made her feel nauseous. "I don't think I can," Clara said, shaking her head. "That was a one-time thing. I didn't expect any of this to happen." The manager placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes kind but persistent. "Clara, I understand how you feel. But you have something special. You shouldn't hide it. People have seen what you can do, and they're asking for more. You don't have to decide right now. But just think about it." Clara didn't know what to think. She didn't want to disappoint anyone, but she also didn't want to push herself into something she wasn't ready for. The thought of performing again filled her with dread. But deep down, there was a part of her that couldn't ignore the possibility. What if it wasn't just about pleasing the guests or meeting their expectations? What if it was about giving herself the chance to truly express what she had kept hidden for so long? Over the next few days, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the manager's words. The idea of performing again scared her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this could be her chance to explore something she had kept buried. Music had always been a part of her, but she had kept it to herself, afraid of what others might think. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. But even as Clara entertained the thought, doubts crept into her mind. What if she failed? What if she couldn't live up to the expectations? What if the guests only liked her because she was unexpected? A maid who could play the piano. She didn't have the experience of a seasoned performer. She didn't know how to prepare for something like this. It was all so overwhelming. One evening after her shift, Clara found herself sitting alone in the small staff lounge. The room was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound. She picked up her phone and began scrolling through messages. Most of them were from co-workers congratulating her on her performance and asking if she would play again. Some were from guests, too. People she didn't know, but who seemed to think she had some sort of special talent. Clara stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she typed a reply. She wanted to be humble, to downplay the whole experience. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about others. It was about her too. She had done something that was true to herself, something she had always longed for, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from it. She put the phone down and looked out the window. The city lights flickered below, casting long shadows over the streets. The world outside seemed so big, so full of possibilities. Clara felt small in comparison, but she also felt something else, a spark, a glimmer of courage that she hadn't felt before. The next morning, Clara made a decision. She walked into the manager's office and told him she would perform again. The relief that washed over her was immediate, but so was the fear. It was one thing to play in front of a few strangers. It was another thing entirely to do it again, knowing that people were expecting something more. But Clara realized something in that moment. She had been given a chance, a rare opportunity to share something that had always been hers, something that mattered to her. And she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. For the next few days, Clara practiced every chance she got. She would find time between shifts, sneaking into the ballroom when no one was around, letting her fingers glide over the keys. The first few days were filled with mistakes and frustration. She was rusty, and the pressure of knowing that people would be watching her made it harder to focus. But little by little, the music began to feel natural again. Clara remembered why she had loved playing so much. It wasn't about the applause or the expectations. It was about the music itself, the way it made her feel connected to something bigger than herself. As the date of the concert approached, Clara found herself growing more and more nervous. She had agreed to play a few pieces, but the thought of performing in front of an audience again made her stomach turn. What if she messed up? What if people weren't impressed this time? What if the magic of that first performance couldn't be repeated? But then on the day of the concert, something shifted. Clara stood backstage looking out at the empty ballroom. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, the lights dimmed. The atmosphere felt different now. There was no laughter, no mockery. It wasn't the same as before. This time, people would come to hear her play because they genuinely wanted to. The music wasn't just a surprise anymore. It was something people were looking forward to. Clara took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The piano gleamed in the spotlight, and as she sat down at the keys, the nerves began to fade. She wasn't just playing for the guests. She was playing for herself, and this time it felt right. Clara sat at the piano once again, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. The room was silent, the audience's breath held in anticipation. This was different from the first time she had played. This time she wasn't just stepping into the unknown. She was standing in front of a crowd who expected more from her. There was no room for mistakes. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but Clara took a deep breath and let it go. She had made the decision to do this, to take the leap. Now there was no turning back. The music began. It was a piece she had always loved, something that had been close to her heart for years. Her fingers found the keys effortlessly, as if the piano was a part of her. The notes filled the room, delicate and powerful at the same time, a reflection of everything Clara had kept inside for so long. She didn't look at the audience, didn't need to. The music was all that mattered now. As she played, Clara lost herself in the melody, the way it spoke to her soul. The nervousness that had gripped her before had faded, replaced by a calmness she hadn't expected. She wasn't playing for anyone but herself. She wasn't performing to impress or to meet anyone's expectations. She was playing because it was what she loved to do, because the music was a part of her that had always been there, waiting to be shared. The audience, for their part, sat in complete silence. There was no whispering, no laughter, just the sound of Clara's playing, filling the space with its beauty. For the first time, Clara felt like she belonged in the spotlight. It wasn't an accident this time. It wasn't a fluke. She had earned this moment. As the piece came to an end, Clara let her fingers rest on the keys, her heart still beating fast. The room remained still for a moment, as if no one could quite believe what they had just heard. And then, as if on cue, the applause began. It started softly, almost as if they were unsure, but quickly grew into a thunderous roar. Clara stood up, her legs weak beneath her, her hands trembling slightly from the effort. The audience rose to their feet, clapping with enthusiasm, some even cheering. Clara looked out at them, unable to believe what was happening. She had done it. She had played in front of them, not as the maid, not as the woman who had been invisible all these years, but as an artist, as a person who had something valuable to offer. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. The event organizers came to her side, their faces filled with pride. "Clara, that was incredible," one of them said, smiling widely. "You've amazed us all. We knew you had it in you, but this—" They shook their heads, still in disbelief. "This was beyond anything we imagined." Clara smiled weakly, still processing the emotions that swirled inside her. She couldn't find the words to express what she felt. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about the fact that she had finally shared something that was hers, something that had always been a part of her. She had allowed herself to be seen, and in doing so, she had given a piece of herself to the world. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara felt a quiet pride fill her. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She wasn't just the person who cleaned the floors or served the guests. She was someone who had something to say, someone who could create something beautiful with her hands. The next few days were a whirlwind. Clara found herself receiving invitations to perform at more events, to play in front of new audiences. People were eager to see her again, eager to hear more of the music that had touched their hearts. For the first time, Clara began to think that maybe this could be something more than just a one-time event. Maybe it could be a new chapter in her life. But even as she received praise and recognition, Clara didn't let it go to her head. She knew that the real value of her music wasn't in the applause or the attention. It was in the way it made her feel, the way it allowed her to express herself when words failed. She had always been an introvert, someone who preferred to stay in the background, but now she had discovered that the background was no longer enough. She had found a voice, and she wasn't going to silence it again. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Clara found herself alone in the hotel's lounge, the soft hum of the city outside providing a peaceful backdrop. She sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap as she reflected on the past few days. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short amount of time. She had once been a maid, someone who had never imagined that she could be more than that. But now she was someone people looked up to, someone whose music had touched others in a way she had never thought possible. It was overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see one of the guests from the event approaching her, a familiar face. The woman had been one of the first to congratulate Clara after her performance. "I just wanted to say again how incredible your performance was," the woman said, smiling warmly. "It's rare to hear music that touches you so deeply. You have such a gift." Clara smiled modestly, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly. The woman sat down beside her, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "I know this is probably a lot to ask, but have you ever thought about sharing your music with a wider audience? Maybe recording an album or performing at larger venues?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't even considered that. Recording an album? Performing in grand theaters? It all seemed so far out of reach, so unrealistic. She wasn't a famous pianist. She was just a maid who had stumbled into a performance and found herself in the spotlight. But as the woman spoke, Clara began to realize something. Maybe it wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. Maybe it wasn't about being famous or well-known. Maybe it was about sharing her music with the world, allowing others to experience what she had always kept to herself. "I don't know," Clara said slowly. "It's a big step," the woman smiled. "It is. But you have something special, Clara. Don't let it go to waste. You deserve to be heard." For the first time, Clara felt a spark of possibility. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't go back to the way things had been. The world had seen her. The world had heard her music. And that was something that would stay with her no matter what happened next. That night, as Clara lay in bed, her thoughts raced. She thought about the audience, the applause, the way the music had made her feel alive in a way she never had before. She thought about the future, about the possibilities that were now open to her. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, but for the first time in her life, Clara felt ready to take it. The days that followed were a blur of excitement and nerves for Clara. She had made the decision to step into something completely new, something she had never imagined for herself. The idea of recording an album, of sharing her music with a wider audience felt like a dream, but it was also a dream that was beginning to feel real. It was all happening so fast, faster than she had ever anticipated. She had never seen herself as an artist in the traditional sense. To her, music had always been a personal refuge, something she did for herself. It was never meant to be shared with anyone. But now she was beginning to see music in a new light. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the connection it could create with others, the way it could move people, the way it could make them feel something deep inside. Clara spent hours practicing each day, going over her pieces, perfecting the small details that would bring the music to life. She had always been her harshest critic, never satisfied with anything less than perfection. But now as she played, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She wasn't playing to meet anyone's expectations. She was playing for herself, for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. But even as Clara practiced, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision she had made. The idea of performing for a larger audience, of recording an album that would be heard by people she didn't know, was both thrilling and terrifying. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the next step. What if she couldn't live up to the expectations? What if her music wasn't good enough? The pressure weighed heavily on her. The guests at the hotel continued to praise her, to tell her how amazing she was, how they couldn't wait to hear more from her. But Clara couldn't escape the feeling that they were all watching, waiting for her to fail. She had only played once, and already there were so many expectations placed on her shoulders. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals, Clara found herself sitting alone in the small staff lounge once again. She was staring out the window, her mind racing, when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see one of the event organizers, the same person who had encouraged her to perform again, standing in the doorway. "Clara," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "How are you feeling about everything?" Clara sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's a lot. I didn't expect it to be this overwhelming." The organizer nodded, his expression understanding. "I know it's a lot to take in, but you're doing something incredible. You've already proven to everyone that you have something special. Don't let the pressure get to you." Clara hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "But what if I'm not ready? What if I fail?" The organizer smiled gently. "Clara, you've already done something many people never get the chance to do. You shared your music with others and it touched them. That's something special. And you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be yourself." Clara looked down at her hands, her fingers still tingling from the hours of practice. She wasn't sure if she could ever stop doubting herself. But the organizer's words brought her a sense of comfort. Maybe he was right. Maybe it didn't matter if she wasn't perfect. What mattered was that she was willing to try, that she was willing to step out of the shadows and share a part of herself with the world. Over the next few days, Clara found herself caught between excitement and fear. She practiced relentlessly, honing her skills, trying to get every note just right. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Every time she sat down at the piano, the weight of the moment seemed to grow heavier. He wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for everyone else too, and that made the stakes feel so much higher. But as the days passed, Clara began to notice something. She started to feel the music in a way she hadn't before. The more she played, the more she realized that the music wasn't something she could perfect or control. It was something that came from deep inside her, something that flowed through her and connected her to the world in a way words never could. One evening, after another long day of practice, Clara decided to take a walk through the hotel's gardens to clear her mind. The air was cool, the night sky above clear and full of stars. She walked slowly, letting the quiet of the garden calm her thoughts. For the first time in a while, she felt a sense of peace. The world felt vast and she felt small, but in the best possible way. As she walked, Clara thought about everything that had brought her here. The music, the applause, the people who had believed in her when she hadn't believed in herself. She thought about the moments of doubt, the fears that had held her back for so long. But now, as she stood in the garden, she realized that the fear wasn't going to go away. She would always have doubts. But that didn't mean she couldn't move forward. She had a choice. She could let the fear stop her, or she could keep going, step by step, even if she wasn't sure where the path would lead. Clara had never been one to take risks, never been one to step outside her comfort zone. But now, for the first time, she felt ready to embrace the unknown. The next day, Clara arrived at the studio to record her album. The room was quiet, filled with equipment she didn't fully understand, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the piano in front of her, the keys that had always been her connection to something deeper. She sat down, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, and began to play. The sound filled the room, warm and rich, and Clara felt a sense of peace wash over her. She was doing this. She was taking the step. As the recording session went on, Clara began to relax. She still felt the nerves, but they were different now. They were no longer overwhelming. She had learned to embrace them, to let them fuel her instead of holding her back. The music flowed from her more easily now, each note filled with emotion and purpose. She wasn't perfect, and she wasn't trying to be. She was just playing the music, sharing it with the world in the way it had always been meant to be shared. By the time the recording was finished, Clara felt a sense of accomplishment she had never known before. The album wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a reflection of who she was, of the journey she had been on, of the fears and doubts she had overcome to get here. As she walked out of the studio, Clara felt lighter, freer than she had in a long time. The weight of her insecurities still lingered, but they didn't define her anymore. She had stepped into the unknown, and in doing so, she had found something more valuable than success or approval. She had found herself. The album was released a few months later, and to Clara's surprise, it was met with overwhelming praise. People were moved by the raw emotion in her music, by the honesty of her performance. But Clara didn't care about the praise. She didn't need the validation. What mattered was that she had shared a part of herself. And that was enough. She continued to play, to share her music, not for the applause, not for the recognition, but because it was something she loved, something that made her feel alive. And in doing so, she had found her place in the world.